StG-44, how Hitler almost killed the world's first assault rifle. Before we tell this story, 5 facts about the Sturmgewehr 44 that you almost certainly don't know. First, the StG-44 is still being used in active combat, not in a museum, on real battlefields. In 2012, Syrian rebel fighters from the Al-Tawhid Brigade posted a video showing a weapons cache seized from government forces. Among the crates, original StG-44s manufactured in 1944, 70 years old, still firing. Second, Hitler didn't just ban the program once, he banned it twice. The first order came in 1942, when the renaming deception was discovered. He stopped production again in early 1943. The weapon survived 2 direct orders for its cancellation. Third, the name Schmeisser is permanently attached to the MP40 in popular culture. In films, books, video games, Hugo Schmeisser had nothing to do with the MP40. Nothing at all. He held a patent on its magazine. That is the full extent of it. The actual designers were Heinrich Vollmer and the Irma Werke factory. Schmeisser didn't design the weapon that carries his name, and he did design the weapon that doesn't. Fourth, the Allies evaluated the StG-44 quite critically. American analysts after the war compared it unfavorably to their M2 carbine, judging the German rifle too heavy for the round it fired. British evaluators found that the receiver walls could be pinched shut with the fingers of one hand, completely immobilizing the bolt. The legend of the Wunderwaffe was largely constructed by post-war historiography. German soldiers valued the weapon, but calling it revolutionary was something that happened after the war was over. And fifth, the word Sturmgewehr, assault rifle, was not coined by Hitler and not by Schmeisser. According to historians Johnston and Nelson, the term was proposed by General Erich Jaschke. Hitler merely signed the order. An entire class of weapon that defined ground tactics for 80 years received its name through a bureaucratic decision whose actual author almost nobody remembers. In the spring of 1943, a German soldier on the Eastern Front was issued a new weapon. It weighed less than his old rifle. It fired automatically like a machine gun, but was light enough to carry into an assault like a pistol. It was accurate at distances that a submachine gun could not manage, and it could suppress an enemy position at ranges that no pistol-caliber weapon had ever reached. The weapon was, by any measure, a revolution in infantry combat. Every assault rifle built since then, the AK-47, the M16, the FAMAS, the G36, the AUG, descends from the principles it established. The soldier who held it in that muddy trench on the Eastern Front was carrying a concept that would define ground warfare for the next 8 decades. His Führer had personally ordered that it not exist. This is the story of the Sturmgewehr 44, the world's first mass-produced assault rifle, and of the remarkable, farcical, and at times genuinely dangerous process by which its creators managed to build it anyway. To understand why the StG-44 was so important, it is necessary to understand the problem it was designed to solve, a problem that had been quietly accumulating in infantry doctrine since the First World War. By 1939, the standard infantry rifle of most major armies was a bolt-action weapon. The German Karabiner 98K, the British Lee Enfield, the Soviet Mosin Nagant, all of them were essentially refined versions of rifles designed in the 1880s and 1890s, firing a full-power cartridge at high velocity over distances of up to 800 meters or more. They were accurate, powerful, and reliable. They were also slow to reload, difficult to fire accurately on the move, and limited to a single shot with each manual cycling of the bolt. At the opposite end of the spectrum, submachine guns, the MP-40 in Germany, the Tommy gun in the United States, the PPSH-41 in the Soviet Union, fired pistol-caliber ammunition at a high rate of automatic fire. Excellent in close-quarters fighting, urban environments, the short-range engagements of street fighting or trench clearing. But their effective range was limited to perhaps 100 to 150 meters. Beyond that, accuracy and lethality dropped sharply. Between these two extremes, the powerful but slow bolt-action rifle and the fast but short-ranged submachine gun, there was a gap that nobody had systematically addressed, because the weapons on either side of it had seemed adequate for the wars being planned. German infantry analysts, studying the combat reports from the early Eastern Front campaigns, began to realize that the gap was not academic. Most infantry firefights, they found, took place at ranges between 100 and 400 meters. At those distances, the bolt-action rifle's long-range precision was largely wasted, and the submachine gun was losing accuracy and stopping power precisely where it was most needed. The conceptual breakthrough that made the assault rifle possible was not a mechanism. It was a cartridge. The problem with automating a full-power rifle cartridge had been understood since the late 19th century. A round designed to travel at 800 meters per second generates enormous recoil when fired. In a bolt-action rifle, that recoil is managed by the shooter's shoulder and the slow manual cycling of the bolt. In an automatic weapon, it causes the muzzle to climb violently after the first shot. Accurate follow-up fire becomes almost impossible without a very heavy, stable weapon. A machine gun on a bipod or tripod. The solution, obvious in retrospect, was to design a cartridge that was intermediate in power between the full rifle round and the pistol round. Powerful enough to be effective at 300 to 400 meters, but generating sufficiently reduced recoil to allow automatic fire in a weapon light. Enough to be carried and aimed by an individual. German engineers at the firm of Polter in Magdeburg produced exactly this cartridge in the late 1930s, designated the 7.9233 mm Kurz meaning short. It used the same 7.92 mm bullet as the standard German rifle round, but in a much shorter case with a reduced powder charge. The result was a round that was effective at infantry engagement ranges and manageable in automatic fire. Two firms were invited to design a weapon around this cartridge. Haenel, whose chief designer was Hugo Schmeisser, a name already associated with some of the most influential German firearms of the century, and Walther, the firm better known for the pistols in the holsters of German officers. Both submitted prototypes in 1940 and 1941. Haenel's design, which Schmeisser would develop into what would eventually become the StG 44, was considered the stronger of the two. Interesting facts. 7.92 57er Mauser, full rifle round. Muzzle energy, 100 joules, 7.92's 33. M. Kurz, intermediate, muzzle energy, 1900 joules, 9.19 mm. Parabellum, pistol, SMG round, muzzle energy, 550 joules. The Kurz sat almost exactly between rifle and pistol. By design, Hugo. Schmeisser was, by 1940, one of the most experienced firearms designers in Germany. His work on the MP-18 submachine gun in the First World War had essentially established the submachine gun as a weapon type. An irony, given that his name would later be incorrectly attached to the MP-40, a weapon he had nothing to do with. The misattribution annoyed him considerably. By all accounts, the weapon that Schmeisser's team at Haenel submitted, the Maschinenkarabiner 42H, or MKB-42H, was a gas-operated, selective fire rifle chambered in the new Kurz cartridge, fed from a curved 30-round detachable box magazine. Its overall layout, pistol grip, magazine ahead of the trigger, carrying handle, established a template that virtually every assault rifle built since has followed in some variation. Field trials in the Soviet Union during 1942 were, by the accounts of the soldiers who used it, remarkably positive. Infantry units issued the MKB-42H reported that it transformed the nature of small unit firefights. A single soldier with the new weapon could lay down the kind of suppressive fire that had previously required a crew-served machine gun. It was accurate enough for aimed shots at 300 meters. Light enough to carry, reload, and aim from the hip while moving. The soldiers, in other words, loved it. The problem was not in the field. The problem was in Berlin. Interesting facts: MKB-42H weight loaded, 4.9 kilo. Kar 98K, 4.1 kilo. MP 40, 4.0 kilo. Rate of fire 500 rounds per minute. Effective range 300.400 meters magazine, a 30-round curved box of the same concept used in the AK-47 6 years later. Adolf Hitler was, among his other characteristics, a man with strong opinions about weapons. He had served as a corporal in the First World War and retained a frontline soldier's instincts that were sometimes sound and sometimes disastrously wrong, and that he held with a certainty that brooked no contradiction from his generals or his ordnance officials. In 1942, Hitler was presented with the MKB-42 program and ordered it canceled. His reasoning rested on two pillars. First, he believed that the Carabiner 98K was adequate for German infantry needs, and that resources devoted to a new weapon were resources diverted from programs he considered more important. Second, and more fundamentally, he distrusted the concept of the intermediate cartridge. A German soldier, in his view, should carry a weapon that could defeat any enemy at any range. Reducing the power of the standard infantry round was, to his mind, a step backward. The Army Ordnance Office, the Heereswaffenamt, faced a dilemma that will be familiar to anyone who has worked in a large organization with an obstructive authority at the top. They were convinced the MKB program was correct. The field reports supported them. The engineers supported them. The soldiers who had used the weapon supported them. And their Führer had told them to stop. What followed was, by the standards of any bureaucracy, a minor masterpiece of institutional deception. The program was not canceled. It was renamed. The MKB-42 became the MP-43 Maschinenpistole 43 submachine gun model 1943. Submachine gun was a category Hitler had approved. The change in designation was, from an engineering standpoint, entirely cosmetic. The weapon was identical. The ammunition was identical. The production continued. The reports that went up the chain of command simply omitted any mention of the fact that MP stood for a weapon type the Army was not actually producing. This fiction was maintained for over a year. Production began in 1943. Soldiers received the weapon under its false designation. Officers filed reports describing its effectiveness under the name that would not trigger a Führer-level veto. The entire German military bureaucracy or at least a significant portion of it, conspired in a polite, bureaucratic lie continued for months about a rifle. Interesting facts: Hitler's cancellation. Order, November 1942. Production of MP-43. Begins April 1943. 5 months after cancellation. Hitler never inspected an MP-43 on the production floor while the bureaucratic drama was playing out in Berlin. Something interesting was happening in the villages and forests of the Eastern Front. The MP-43, as soldiers were required to call it, was proving itself in exactly the conditions that the Army's analysts had predicted. The situation on the Eastern Front by late 1943 was one of increasing German defensive pressure. Soviet offensives following Kursk were pushing German units back toward the Dnieper River and beyond. Infantry units defending against Soviet attacks, which frequently combined massed infantry with tank support, found that the new weapon fundamentally changed what a small unit could do. German squad armed with MP-43s could hold a position against a much larger attacking force by virtue of the sustained, accurate automatic fire the weapon provided. In close-range defensive fighting, through buildings, across rubbled streets, from prepared positions in tree lines, the ability to fire multiple rounds without cycling a bolt, at ranges where those rounds were still accurate and lethal, was not a minor improvement. It was transformative. The commanders in the field began sending reports upward. Not politely worded requests, actual urgent representations that the Army needed more of these weapons, as quickly as possible, and that units equipped with them were demonstrably more effective in defensive engagements than units with a mixture of Kar-98K rifles and MP-40 submachine guns. Among the most striking accounts is a letter, widely cited in subsequent histories, from soldiers of Army Group South. It stated directly that the new weapon was the most important infantry development of the war, that every soldier who used it preferred it to any combination of existing weapons, and that the Army should move immediately to universal issue. It was signed by several senior officers and forwarded to Hitler's headquarters. Interesting facts. A 10-man squad with MP-43s estimated to deliver suppressive fire equivalent to a 15-man squad with mixed Kar-98K MP-40 reported preference among issued soldiers. Approximately 9 in 10 preferred the MP-43 by late 1943. The deception had become increasingly difficult to sustain. Too many units were equipped with the weapon. Too many reports mentioned it. And critically, Hitler had become aware that German soldiers were sending messages from the front expressing enthusiasm for a weapon designated as a submachine gun that seemed, from the descriptions, to perform nothing like any submachine gun he knew of. There are conflicting accounts of exactly how and when the truth became apparent. What is clear from the documentary record is this. In July 1944, at a meeting of senior army commanders on the Eastern Front situation, Hitler asked what his generals needed most. One of them exclaimed, "More of these new rifles." Hitler's reported response, "What new rifles?" Once he was shown the weapon and a live demonstration arranged, he fired it, he examined it, and he was told, gently, what it was, what cartridge it fired, and that it had been in production for the better part of a year under a name that was technically inaccurate. His reaction, according to various accounts, was not the explosion of fury that might have been expected. He approved the weapon. He approved it, it seems, because the demonstration was convincing, because the reports from the front were unambiguous, and because, whatever his theoretical objections, the soldiers who were actually being shot at had expressed a clear preference. He then renamed it again. The MP-43, briefly redesignated MP-44 to reflect the new production year, became the Sturmgewehr 44. Sturmgewehr, assault rifle. The word assault rifle as a category of weapon was coined in this moment. The irony of a man who had banned the weapon's development for 2 years, then presiding over the naming of the entire category it represented, may have been lost on him. It has not been lost on historians since. Interesting facts: MP43, MP44, StG 44. 3 names, 1 weapon, no engineering changes. The term Sturmgewehr, assault rifle, enters the military lexicon, 1944. Hitler's approval, once given, was enthusiastic. He reportedly called for universal infantry issue. A brief examination of the weapon itself helps explain why its influence has been so lasting. The StG-44 operates by gas actuation. A portion of the propellant gas generated when the cartridge fires is bled off through a port in the barrel and used to cycle the action, moving the bolt rearward against spring pressure, ejecting the spent case and allowing the spring to drive the bolt forward again, chambering a new round from the magazine. This principle, used in one form or another in virtually every automatic weapon designed since, is not unique to the StG-44, but Schmeisser's implementation was notably reliable for the manufacturing tolerances and field conditions of wartime Germany. The tilting bolt locking system was straightforward and robust. The 30-round curved magazine, curved because the 7.92 33 mm. Kurt's cartridge has a degree of taper that makes straight magazines feed unreliably, set a visual template that the AK-47 would replicate at slightly different proportions using the similar Soviet 7.62 39mm intermediate cartridge. The weapon had 2 notable weaknesses. It was heavy for its category, approximately 5.2 kilograms loaded, because of its all-steel construction at a time when manufacturing shortcuts were increasingly necessary. And it was expensive and time-consuming to produce, requiring machining operations that strained Germany's increasingly overstretched industrial capacity. Late in the war, a simplified version, the Sturmgewehr 45, was developed using a different operating principle that required far less machining. This weapon, which Schmeisser also worked on, was captured by Allied forces and became the direct ancestor of the Setny rifle and, through it, of the Heckler & Koch G3, one of the most widely used military rifles of the second half of the 20th century. Interesting facts: StG-44 weight, loaded 522 kg, length 940 mm, barrel 400 decent 1 9 met cyclic, rate 500 600 rpm, muzzle velocity 685 mm/s, total produced 499,977. Are short of demand. The relationship between the StG-44 and the AK-47 is one of the most argued questions in the history of firearms design, argued specifically about whether it constitutes direct influence or independent parallel development. The facts that are not disputed are these. Following Germany's surrender in May 1945, Soviet forces occupied the Haenel factory in Suhl, Thuringia, Schmeisser's workplace, and found both finished weapons and extensive engineering documentation. Schmeisser himself, along with several other German firearms engineers, was taken to the Soviet Union in 1946 to the Izhevsk Arms Complex, where the AK-47 was being developed under Mikhail Kalashnikov. Schmeisser and his colleagues remained in Izhevsk until 1952. The precise nature of their contribution to the AK-47 program is disputed. Soviet and Russian sources have consistently maintained that Kalashnikov's design was entirely independent and that the German engineers played no significant role. Kalashnikov himself, interviewed many times on the subject, denied any direct copying. The most careful historians of the period, including those with no particular nationalist interest in either direction, tend to conclude that the truth lies somewhere between direct copying and complete independence. The AK-47's rotating bolt locking mechanism differs fundamentally from the StG-44's tilting bolt and represents genuine innovation that the German weapon did not suggest. Archival evidence indicates the AK's core prototype had already been submitted for trials in 1947, and German engineers at Ijevsk were officially barred from access to classified rifle development programs. Perhaps the most honest summary is this: the AK-47 was influenced by the concept that the StG-44 represented the intermediate cartridge selective fire individual weapon and may have been informed by some of its design details. It was not copied. It was a new design built in the presence of the old one, by engineers who could hardly avoid being aware of it. Interesting facts: Hugo Schmeisser in Ijevsk, 1946, 1952, AK-47 adopted by the Soviet Army, 1949. 3 years after Schmeisser's arrival, AK pattern rifles produced globally since 1949. Estimated 150 million. The influence of the StG-44 did not flow only through the Soviet Union and the AK-47. The concept of the intermediate cartridge assault rifle reached American designers through a different path, through captured weapons, post-war analysis, and the work of engineers who understood that the German experiment had proved something important. Eugene Stoner, working at Armalite in the 1950s, developed the AR-10 and then the AR-15 around a different intermediate cartridge, the 5.56 Sex 45mm, considerably smaller and lighter than either the German Kurz or the Soviet 7.62 39mm, and a different operating principle, using direct gas impingement rather than a piston. The result was a weapon even lighter than the StG-44, with reduced recoil and high velocity, at the cost of somewhat increased mechanical sensitivity to dirt and fouling. The AR-15, adopted by the U.S. military as the M16 in the early 1960s, became the standard American infantry rifle and remains, in updated form, the primary weapon of the United States Armed Forces today. Like the AK-47, it is conceptually a descendant of the problem the StG-44 identified and the solution it proposed: a selective fire weapon firing an intermediate cartridge at effective infantry engagement ranges. The specific mechanisms differ. The concept is the same. Interesting facts: 5.56 45mm NATO, muzzle energy, 1 sabun 770 joules. Comparable to the 7.92's 33mm Kurzhem. 16 weight loaded, 3.6 kilo. StG 44 loaded, 5.2 kilos, a 30% reduction over 2 decades. Both descend from the same conceptual breakthrough, the intermediate cartridge. It is tempting, examining this story, to ask what might have happened if Hitler had approved the program in 1942 rather than canceling it. If production had begun a year earlier in volume, with the full support of German industrial capacity, which was in 1942 considerably less strained than it would become in 1943 and 1944. The question is speculative, and historians are appropriately cautious about counterfactuals. What can be said is this: the approximately 425,000 StG-44s that were ultimately produced were never sufficient to equip more than a fraction of German infantry units. Soldiers who received them were demonstrably more effective in defensive engagements. Soldiers who did not continue to rely on a combination of weapons that the Army's own analysts had identified as inadequate for the conditions they faced, whether a different weapons decision in 1942 could have materially affected the outcome of the war on the Eastern Front is a question that cannot be answered with confidence. The Soviet advantage in production, manpower, and by 1943, tactical sophistication was substantial enough that individual weapons improvements, however significant, were unlikely to have been decisive. But the delay imposed by Hitler's intervention was real, and its cost, measured in the gap between what German infantry had and what they needed, was paid by the soldiers in the field. Hugo Schmeisser died in 1953, in East Germany, having returned from the Soviet Union the previous year. He left no memoir. His precise contribution to the development of Soviet small arms remains, as it was in his lifetime, a matter of some dispute. The StG 44 survives in museums across Europe, the United States, and Russia. Its lines are recognizable to anyone who has ever seen a modern assault rifle, which is to say, to almost anyone alive today, in a world where the assault rifle has become the defining individual weapon of ground combat. The word Sturmgewehr, assault rifle, was, by most accounts, coined by a man who had spent 2 years trying to prevent the weapon from existing. He gave it a name that captured, better than any technical designation, what it actually was: a rifle for the assault. For infantry closing with an enemy across the 100 to 400 meters that separated the weapon from its target, at the ranges where wars are actually decided by the men who carry them. Every assault rifle in the world today, every AK, every M16, every G36, every AUG, every Taver is, in the most literal sense, a Sturmgewehr. The name has outlasted the regime that coined it, the war that tested it, and the man who designed it. In that sense, at least, the weapon got the last word.